Hello. Today I am going to talk about two Nobel laureates who have shaped and developed macroeconomics over the last half a century, Robert Lucas Jr. and Edward C. Prescott. Robert Lucas won the Nobel Prize in 1995 while Ed Prescott won the Nobel Prize in 2004. Now, apart from the fact that these two have been two of the most influential economists over the last few decades, there's another personal reason why I chose to talk about these two economists. I've been fortunate enough to interact with both of them. This was during my time in Minnesota, where I was pursuing my PhD. Robert Lucas, or Bob Lucas, was visiting the Minneapolis Fed and would often be at the department during seminars and also, for example, during picnics and stuff like that. Ed Prescott, on the other hand, was an integral part of the department when I was there, and he taught me macroeconomics. Now, before the 1970s, macroeconomics had diverged from microeconomics and some other branches of economics. In some sense, there were two very distinct economics that was being studied. One which started with assumptions on preferences and production functions and used choices made by agents to come to some conclusion. The other was simply a system of equations. One may be an equation for investment, another may be an equation describing consumption, another may be money demand, and so on and so on. The work of these two, particularly Robert Lucas, synthesized these two and brought them together. So the modern macroeconomics as we know today owes a great deal to both of them. Now, often people would say that Robert Lucas brought in a sea change from the Keynesian economics that was being studied earlier. But probably a better way of looking at it is that it was a natural progression of economics as science. As Gregory Mankiw writes about Robert Lucas, his great contribution to the discipline was to analyze how government policies influence the economy in part through their effect on people's expectations. A lesson that Keynes would likely have appreciated, but that early followers of Keynes often ignored. In that sense, it's a synthesis of different branches of economics and also in some ways different ideas in economics into macroeconomics. So what's Lucas's contribution? I think it's best summed up by V.V. Chari. He says that he contributed both to the methodological part of it as well as to the substantial part of it. The methodological contribution is to illustrate that how one goes about constructing dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models to shed light on questions of substantive economic interest. Now, the substantive contribution is to develop and analyze a specific mechanism by which monetary instability leads to fluctuations in output and inflation. He goes on to say, it's hard to overemphasize the contribution to method. Economists today routinely analyze systems in which agents often operate in a complex probabilistic environments in order to understand interactions about which the great theorists of an earlier generation could only speculate. This sea change is due in substantial part to Lucas. Robert Lucas was born in 1937 in Yakima, Washington, United States, right in the midst of Great Depression. And the recession affected him right away. His parents had a small restaurant, the Lucas Ice Creamery, which was affected by the Great Depression, and the family moved to Seattle soon after. Robert Lucas did his schooling in Seattle and graduated from Roosevelt High School in 1955. He was good in maths and sciences, and there was a general expectation that he would go on to do engineering. However, he received a scholarship from University of Chicago, which did not have engineering. So he chose to study maths. He took up a few maths courses, but soon lost interest. What attracted him at that point of time were courses which were parts of the liberal arts core, things like Western civilization, Aristotle, Plato, and he went on to graduate as a major in history. But during that time, he also realized that he wanted to be an academician. And in his own words, I had learned that one can make a living by pursuing one's intellectual interests and writing about them. So he went on to join University of California, Berkeley to pursue a history PhD. There he faced challenges, particularly the fact that he didn't know much Greek and Latin. At the same time, he started taking some courses, particularly economic history and things like that. And he immediately liked economics. And he decided to change over to economics. However, there wasn't much an opportunity to get scholarship in economics at Berkeley, so he moved back to Chicago. He took a few economics courses, undergraduate economics courses, as well as graduate economics courses in Chicago. In particular, he was influenced greatly by a textbook by Samuelson. So, Paul Samuelson's Foundations of Economic Analysis attracted him a lot, and he needed to brush up a little bit on his calculus, but he worked through the book and became a very good technician in economics. So when he started his PhD program in economics at Chicago, he was quite well prepared for it. There, he took a course which was offered by Milton Friedman, a series of courses probably, on price theory. This again influenced him greatly in trying to think about economic problems, and he tried to bring together what he learned from the Samuelson book and what he heard in the class together. Chicago was an exciting place for a budding economist at that point of time. He benefited greatly from several faculty members and courses that he took there. Particularly, he liked Arnold Herberger's Sequence in Public Finance and went on to do a PhD which was supervised by Arnold Herberger and Greg Lewis. It was also a time where there were great students at Chicago who went on to become very eminent economists. These included Glenn Kane, Neil Wallace, Sherwin Rosen, and G.S. Madala. All of them were friends and studying economics and went on to do great economic work later on. In 1963, he got an offer for a faculty position at the Graduate School of Industrial Administration at what we now know as the Carnegie Mellon University. He took up that position. At that point of time, Herbert Simon was part of the university, though he was no longer working primarily in economics, but he had great influence on the university's intellectual climate. Lucas greatly benefited from that. After completing his thesis, he began theoretical work on decisions of business firms to invest in physical capital and improved technology. This was influenced by one of his committee members, Dale Jorgensen. He started learning the maths that was required, maths of the dynamical system and optimization over time, and then apply these to the economic models. Carnegie Mellon also had a remarkable group of economists at that point of time. It was very vibrant. One particular economist who was doing his PhD at Harvard but was visiting Carnegie Mellon was Thomas Sergent. Another person who went on to win the Nobel Prize later on was there. And then the same year, as he has joined as an assistant professor at Carnegie Mellon, Ed Prescott, the second Nobel laureate that I'm going to talk about, joined as a graduate student. Their friendship and collaboration continued beyond the Carnegie Mellon and went on to produce some amazing work in macroeconomics. When Ed Prescott joined the University of Pennsylvania as an assistant professor, they continued to work on economic dynamics, and the paper that came out of their collaboration at that point of time was called Investment Under Uncertainty, where they studied the time series property of macroeconomic variables and outputs when demand was stochastic. And that was a substantial improvement on the knowledge, and that was a substantial contribution to the knowledge at that point of time. Now, before I talk about some of his other very influential work, it's probably worth mentioning here that there's another way Robert Lucas has influenced macroeconomics in a tremendous manner. It's through the book which was co-written with Nancy Stokey, his current partner, and Ed Prescott. The book Recursive Method in Economic Dynamics, published in 1989, changed how macroeconomics was taught in graduate school and influenced economics and economists through the years, including me. One of his most influential works, and the one that was mentioned by the Nobel citation, came in the early 1970s. His paper, Expectations and Neutrality of Money, which gave birth to what we now popularly refer to as the rational expectations model, was published in 1972. Lucas in that paper asks, how do changes in the conduct of monetary policy affect inflation, output, and unemployment? Not a new question. This question has been asked by economists over ages, at least since David Hume in 1752. However, there was no clear understanding of the cause and the effect of monetary policy on real variables. Lucas uses an overlapping generations model for this analysis. In his model, there are two sources of uncertainty. Allocation across traders who operate in physically separated markets is stochastic. And the second is that the quantity of money is also stochastic. Both of these impact the price, and agents who observe price cannot distinguish between these two shocks. So, in the short run, this can generate fluctuations, but what he showed is in the long run, the changes in the money supply will have no impact on the real variables. This is again popularly referred to as the fact that government or policymakers cannot persistently fool people because they form rational expectations. In this, Lucas emphasizes the distinction between anticipated and unanticipated change in the stock of money. There is a significant methodological contribution in this paper too. The methodological contribution is to illustrate how one goes about constructing a dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model to shed light on questions of substantive nature in economics. And this was a big departure from the way macroeconomics was done in the past. The second paper that was also cited by the Nobel Committee and has immensely impacted economics over the last few decades was titled Econometric Policy Valuation, a Critique. This was published in 1976, and what we again popularly call as Lucas' critic was outlined in this paper. By then, he had returned to University of Chicago, has moved on from Carnegie Mellon University to University of Chicago as the John Dewey Distinguished Service Professor. So he shaped economics through these papers, but also through the intellectual climate that was there in Chicago. So in this paper, what he does is he looks at how macroeconometric models operate at that point of time. In macroeconometric models at that point of time, people would often estimate parameters through a system of equations and then use those parameters to figure out how changes would occur when there was a change in the policy. This approach would be fine if the parameters were invariant to the change in the policy. But economists knew that it wasn't the case. The parameters depended on the expectations of the policy. What Lucas showed was that the expectations dependent on the nature of the policy regime in place, and therefore are likely to change systematically with the regime. Hence, past parameters are of no use in understanding future policy regimes. One important implication of Lucas's work is that a government that is credible, that is, a government that makes itself understood and believed, can quickly end major inflation without bringing in a big increase in unemployment. There are several other papers, and most of these papers have been very influential. I'll mention just two, some that I personally like. One is a 1978 paper titled Asset Prices in an Exchange Economy, in which he derived prices as a function of the state of the economy. This work is central to asset pricing theory as we do today. In 1998, he also wrote a paper on economic growth. The paper was titled On the Mechanics of Economic Development, where he tried to think about the development process as a whole integrated thing rather than thinking of developed economies separately from the developing economies. In many ways, Lucas's work, along with some other contemporary macroeconomists, reshaped the macroeconomics and placed it firmly within the standard economic theory that was being developed, particularly the general equilibrium theory. So that brings me to talk about the second Nobel laureate that I wanted to talk about today, Edward C. Prescott. As I've already mentioned, Ed Prescott interacted closely with Robert Lucas from his days in the graduate school at Carnegie Mellon. And they developed this partnership throughout the years. Ed Prescott was born in 1940 in Glen Eagles, New York. He grew up there and went to school in that small town. At school, he liked maths, and the school also had a good science program. He was particularly fascinated by the whole concept of proof, and he liked courses like plane geometry and things like that. He also liked sports, and throughout his school and college, he had played sports of different types and kinds very actively. And he kind of enjoyed that diversion from other activities during school and college. After high school, he decided to join Swarthmore College. This was a personal choice, and given his nature, he thought he would be more comfortable in an environment that Swarthmore offered compared to some of the Ivy League schools. He, however, did not quite enjoy the intellectual climate at the college. As he says, I thought it was less intimidating and somewhat less expensive than the Ivy League universities, and therefore I joined Swarthmore College. But he found the intellectual environment to be very one-dimensional. During school, he wanted to be a rocket scientist, so he joined the physics program. However, in his third year, he dropped out of the physics program. He was no longer enjoying physics, particularly the long lab hours. He decided to become a maths major, and he graduated as a maths major from Swarthmore College. At that point, he had taken a course on engineering economics and quite liked it. This led him to choose the graduate program at Carnegie Mellon at the Graduate School of Industrial Administration, where Lucas was an assistant professor at that point of time. But during the period where he pursued maths at Swarthmore College, he picked up very important skills like probability theory and other maths tools that would come very handy later on. He found the Graduate School of Industrial Administration to be very exciting and stimulating. Of course, there were a bunch of people who were very actively working on some of the major problems at that point of time in economics and also in artificial intelligence. Herbert Simon was there. There were a great set of people who were working in cutting edge problems in economics, but also in other areas like artificial intelligence. Herbert Simon was there, but there were a bunch of others who were working in artificial intelligence, and he ended up taking courses also in artificial intelligence. He eventually did his PhD under Michael C. Lovell, though Maurice de Groot, who was a statistician, also contributed towards his thesis. After GSIA, the Graduate School of Industrial Administration at Carnegie Mellon, he joined University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And there again, he got to interact with a great set of people. Some of them again would contribute handsomely to economics. In particular, he benefited a lot in his interactions with Lawrence Klein, another Nobel laureate. It is here where he worked on the paper Investment Under Uncertainty with Lucas. This paper methodologically contributed a lot. He was very influenced by Debrew's paper on general equilibrium theory, a short paper that made him think about how to use that in answering substantive questions in economics. He, along with Robert Lucas, went ahead and introduced general equilibrium theory to think about a variety of macroeconomics problems. At Penn, University of Pennsylvania, he also developed a friendship and partnership with Tom Cooley, another noted macroeconomist, who was a student there at that point of time. Tom Sergent, another Nobel laureate, also joined University of Pennsylvania as an assistant professor while Prescott was still there. However, Prescott was offered a position at Carnegie Mellon, and he chose to move to Carnegie Mellon as a professor there. And at that point, he interacted with some other great macroeconomists like Costas Azerdias, but in particular Finn Kinland, with whom he shares the Nobel Prize. It was with Finn Kinland that he wrote the celebrated papers Rules Rather Than Discretion, The Inconsistency of Optimal Plans, and Time to Build an Aggregate Fluctuation. In 1982, that was published. These papers were developed during Prescott's visit to Norway, where Kinland was a faculty member. They were studying policy selection in a dynamic and uncertain environment. While working on this, as Prescott says, he realized macroeconomy or macro policy is a game and not a control problem as they had originally thought. And that is the essence of the rules versus discretion paper, that policy has to be seen as a game. They showed that discretionary policy may not result in social welfare maximization. This has a huge implication in all kinds of policy making. But the immediate impact perhaps was in monetary policy making. This shows that it is better for central banks to follow a rule-based policy, and that is communicated clearly to all. The paper, Time to Build and Aggregate Fluctuations, they modified the equilibrium growth model and used that to talk about and think about the cyclical behavior of some of the aggregate variables like GDP and investment. They studied the time series properties of these variables and also the covariances between them. And this is what that led to the modern real business cycle theory. The great contribution is to show that expansions and contractions are both part of an equilibrium, as opposed to the economy being in disequilibrium as was previously envisioned. This also has implications on policy making, particularly how governments deal with recessions and what kind of fiscal policies are optimal. After coming back from Norway, he continued at Carnegie Mellon, though he had clear intentions of moving to some other university. He was a well-established econometrician at that point of time, but he didn't want to continue as an econometrician, and that led to a prolonged job search. But during that period, he collaborated with another student at Carnegie Mellon, Rajneesh Mehra, and in late 1979 they wrote the Equity Premium Puzzle, which again has a huge influence on the economic literature in the next decades. In 1978-79, he visited the University of Chicago as the Ford Foundation Research Professor. The following year, he visited Northwestern University, and while visiting the economics department at the Northwestern University, he received an offer from University of Minnesota and decided to accept it. The reason why he decided to accept the offer, and here let me use his own words. Minnesota had the best graduate program and was leading producer of new assistant professors, with Thomas Sergent and Neil Wallace in macro. I think the success of the Minnesota program was due to its tradition of insisting that students first define terms, state their proposition, and then rigorously establish their proposition. With this approach, he says, if you disagree with the conclusion, you have to disagree with one of the assumptions. The ample supply of ambitious, imaginative students was also critical to the success of the program. This excited him a lot, and he went on to join Minnesota, where he remained as a professor for about 25 years. He also started his long association with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis while he was there in Minnesota. Note though, Minnesota did not hire him as a macro professor, but as a professor in the area of industrial organization. During his almost a quarter century association with Minnesota, he worked with a large number of students and colleagues there. But by mid-1990s, there was a fallout between the department and the university administration, and he was not happy to continue there. The economics department was downsized in the mid-1990s, and Ed Prescott was quite unhappy about that. So in 1998, he chose to move to Chicago. However, an unfortunate family emergency led him back to Minnesota in 1999. But now, again, he found new enthusiasm about the department, particularly in working with colleagues at both the department and the Federal Reserve Bank. This is also the time where I interacted with him, and he taught me macroeconomics. He tackled a variety of problems and had a very productive time, including how to include stock markets within macroeconomic models, how to think about tax structures in the United States, and so on. He not only taught graduate macroeconomics course, but he also taught an undergraduate macroeconomics course, and he was very enthusiastic about that course in particular because he wanted to change how macroeconomics was being taught at an undergraduate level. But more importantly, he was very excited about the kind of questions he will get from undergraduate students, and some of them led to him improving his work. In particular, his book with Parente, The Barriers to Reach, was a result of some of the questions he has faced in an undergraduate class. He received his Nobel Prize in 2004, just after he left Minnesota after a fallout with the university administration. He had joined the Arizona State University at that point, and he continued to work on a variety of macroeconomic problems at that university. So till this date, his work and Robert Lucas's work influences how macroeconomics is done methodologically and the kind of questions we try to address in macroeconomics. It's probably not an overstatement to say that they were two of the best minds in macroeconomics over the last half a century. Thank you.